we're now getting some questions here, and I think there's a set of questions that we've sort of touched on already, and that is around, it's one thing to denounce, it's one thing to point to violations, but what are the solutions? What can Amnesty do? What does Amnesty do? And what can individuals do to move towards actual solutions to these issues that we're seeing tonight?
Well, I think it's absolutely right. It's not about pointing fingers as much as about working with people to find solutions. And there are many concrete solutions that can be found. Take the issue of slums, which is one of the aspects of our Demand Dignity campaign. And what we want to do is we want to end forced evictions. We want evictions to be accompanied with some form of due process so that people get compensation, that people's views are heard, and people are not pushed off their homes illegally and with force. Now, for that, you can do something. I was in Kibera in June this year. We met with the local housing coalition there, and we actually, 750 people came out of those slums and marched with us down the streets of Nairobi. We are now discussing with the government a set of very clear policy guidelines about evictions and about housing policy in Kibera. Now, and we're working with the local housing coalition in Nairobi, and these are several dozen organizations, local organizations, working with us to use international standards to put pressure on the government to change the way in which housing laws are applied in Kenya. That's a very concrete example. Take the situation in Sierra Leone. Now, in Sierra Leone, we have launched a campaign to end maternal mortality. Now, 1 in 8 women die in Sierra Leone, and they die because healthcare is not available, because funds for healthcare are mismanaged, but they also die because there is severe discrimination against women. Women in the rural areas of Sierra Leone are regarded as minors, so they don't decide whether to access healthcare or not. Those decisions are made by someone else. There is underage marriage. Girls as young as 13 and 14 are married, and then when they become pregnant, of course, they are unable to have safe delivery. So we are working in Sierra Leone with the local women. We're also working with the local traditional leaders to get them to recognize that women's lives have to be valued. So that is on the social side. On the political side, we are discussing with the government how healthcare can be improved. We are discussing with the Anti-Corruption Commissioner how to bring down corruption in the health system. And then the government that Sierra Leone needs more confidence. The poor country, the president has announced free healthcare to pregnant women and children. That will not happen. And we then work with the donors, with the government, and with the women to ensure that they have the right to health. And that's their right to health. These are very concrete measures that we can take to bring about change. So what I'm talking about when I say any human rights abuses that keep people poor, it's not abstract concepts. These are very real issues of justice, equality, and equity.
I wonder if I could just add one more example that's a little closer to home. That has to do with maternal mortality right here in the United States. We are at Amnesty International USA preparing a report on what happens to women in this country who give birth. It is, I think, again, a scandal, but a scandal that very few people know about, that the United States among developed countries is almost dead last in terms of its rates of maternal mortality. We have one of the highest rates, if in many respects, the highest rate of maternal mortality and other horrible outcomes of healthcare of any developed country in the world. I think only Estonia has a worse record than the United States among developed countries. And when you disaggregate the figures, you see that women of color have rates of maternal mortality, are dying. I hate these euphemisms like maternal mortality, are dying giving birth at 4 times the rate of other women. There is no medical reason for this. If you talk with people, they will tell you that this doesn't have to happen. Not one woman has to die from giving birth in this country. So why is it happening? Well, we're going to identify why it's happening, and we're going to launch a campaign here in this country. And the real reason has to do with political will. It has to do with our acceptance of a system where women die from giving birth for no reason. And when you read those stories, when you talk with people, as we did when we visited a center in the Bronx, you talk to the women who are on the front lines working with poor women, I have the same feeling I used to have when I used to hear stories about people being taken out on the street and shot by death squads. And that is to say, this is an unnecessary, totally unnecessary amount of suffering and death. And it's the same feeling when you realize that women are dying simply because they're poor, that poverty kills. So we're going to come up with very specific recommendations, and we will be asking everybody in this room and everybody in rooms across the country to join us in the campaign. The only way to turn it around is through political will. And the only way to build that political will is not if Amnesty International does X, Y, or Z, but if all of us consider ourselves part of the human rights movement, and as part of that movement, we take the action to say this is unacceptable in the United States of America.
I was going to say, did everybody in this room hear that? A couple of other questions in other areas. One, as you know, there's great concern now and great movement, particularly on university campuses, around the environment. Could you tell us a little bit about this campaign that you're launching, Amnesty's efforts on poverty, and how that will affect the planet, creation, the environment?
Well, climate change is actually the sort of the ultimate challenge, because if you don't have a sustainable way of living, the planet doesn't exist, then of course human beings won't exist, and there will be no issue of human rights. So there is a very close link between climate change and the work we are doing. And you can see that very clearly when you look at the situation of women around the world. We're talking about women's rights. Now, in most poor countries, it's women who collect water and firewood, and they are having to walk longer and longer. And usually they are not women, they're young girls. And that means that they have less time for many other things, including education. So there is almost a direct impact on health, education, and livelihood of the impact of climate change. If you look at the issue of slums, what are we talking about? You know, when we say slums, what are we really talking about? We are talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being pushed off their land because their land is no longer productive, coming into cities, and in the cities having no access to water, sanitation, or good housing, and therefore adding to the environmental problems in the cities. Now, that's has a direct impact on people's lives. If you take my own country, Bangladesh, which is basically the Ganges Delta. Now, in the Ganges Delta, erosion because of deforestation in the Himalayas means that the rivers are getting silted up, so you're having more frequent floods. People are being pushed off their land. Farmers are losing, and these are subsistence farmers. They're losing their means of subsistence. They cannot even subsist, so it's the lowest possible degree of survival. And these people are then flooding into, moving into neighboring countries, and where there is then conflict and tension and all kinds of human rights abuses arising from that. So Amnesty International will have to confront those problems. We will confront them through our Demand Dignity campaign in the context of the issues we pick up on slums. We will confront it in the context of our campaign on women's rights, and we will confront it in the context of protecting civilians in conflict situations. So there are many different ways in which climate change and human rights will conflict. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is sustainable development. And sustainable development means development which respects human rights.